I arrived in August of 2016 at the museum, and I was very drawn to Baltimore for a variety of reasons. I think sometimes you have a feeling about a place and a feeling about a museum. And I wanted to experiment with the idea of making what I take to be a golden generation of Black American artists led by the likes of Mark Bradford and Theaster Gates, to take the work that they were doing in their studio and beyond and make it the leading conceptual edge of a museum in a Black majority city. What I didn't know was that the BMA had aspiration to shift its program in the direction of greater relevance, but didn't quite know the direction or how to get there at the time. And I was so impressed, I think, by the interview process, because there was such a wide open willingness on the part of the museum to entertain something bold and something different, something maybe a little bit uncomfortable. And we talk a lot at the museum about the necessity to sit in discomfort with other people if you want to achieve sustained change. And I think since 2016, we've been doing that work day to day. And it was really codified in 2018 when we adopted these mission and vision statements. And the impulse was to try and apply language to the work we were doing, to capture the language really precisely, and to differentiate ourselves in the boldness of our direction from other institutions as their mission and visions are articulated. So you'll see here that there's a great emphasis, and this I think you'll see throughout the course of my presentation, on structural change. So when I say structural change within a museum, I mean all phases of our activity. So exhibitions, acquisitions, public programs, board, staff, vendor decisions, investment decisions, all things fed through the same lens, grounded in concepts of social equity, in diversity and justice, and in projecting to our community the values that we think should structure societies. So it's a way of kind of world modeling. And I think that museums historically have emphasized creative program over the creation of policy. And I think the artists that are our leading edge now, the Bradfords of the world, are not only producing extraordinary paintings that change the course of art history, they're also founding not-for-profits based in need that are advancing social ideas that are the natural extension of their work. So I want our museum to embody as many of those standards as possible. And I don't think that that's possible if you emphasize only a creative program, meaning sort of the core activities of a museum, exhibitions, acquisitions, public programs. It seemed to us really logical to try and extend those ideologies way beyond the galleries and to our back of house and become as accessible to our public as possible in the process. So these are the structure and concepts behind what I'll present to you. And next slide, please. And the next one. So pretty naturally, when you're coming to a museum with a change-based agenda, you work with those things at your fingertips that you're most familiar with to telegraph radical change quickly. And Jack Whitten's sculpture 1963 to 2016 was a really good example. So this is a show that opened in April of 2018. I arrived in August of 2016. My first project was to renovate these extraordinary changing exhibition spaces, and you're seeing a small view of them here. And we elected not to dedicate those galleries with an inevitable blockbuster exhibition, Picasso, Matisse, etc., that would have seen lines around the block, but rather a show of a recently deceased artist known as a painter who for 50 years had privately made sculpture in an island in Greece. So not the most conventional decision to announce yourself, but we did it. Co-organized this exhibition with the Met, I think is one of the great scholarly contributions of the 21st century. Katie Siegel, my constant collaborator, was the curator. It was extraordinarily well received critically, and the sculptures were an absolute revelation, but the attendance was, to be perfectly honest, quite woeful. And that had to do with being, I think, out beyond our audience. I think it had to do with not properly earning the sort of trust and investment of our audience. It was absolutely the right thing to do, but it was a lot in a short time. So an object lesson, I think, for the museum. And next slide. So you can just keep flipping through the slides a little bit and I'll talk. So again, here we can pause on Mark Bradford. As I said, he is somebody who I look to as a sort of North Star, and we were very fortunate to be the commissioning entity for the Venice Biennale in 2017. And we brought that exhibition to Baltimore, installed it in our galleries exactly as it was seen in Venice, free of charge for the city to experience. And I think, you know, nothing encapsulates the elitism of the art world quite like the Venice Biennale. Not only do you have to know that it's going on, you have to be able to afford to fly there. You have to be able to afford entry into the pavilions, et cetera, and so forth. So there are so many barriers to access. And I think Mark's work, Mark's carriage, Mark's personhood is all about democracy of access. So it was very, very important, again, for us to bring the show to Baltimore as a way to sort of embody our commitment to make this kind of adventurous intellectual work fully and completely public. And the next slide, please. So, and the next one, I'm just showing you various images here. This is a really important one to emphasize: everyday selections from the permanent collection. So we, like every other institution, or most other institutions in this country, narrate the post-war story through a series of canonical movements. All of you are going to be familiar with them. Abex, followed by Colorfield, followed by minimalism, followed by post-minimalism, followed by conceptualism, and blah, blah, blah. So, you know, there are various and sundry problems with that. One is that every museum across the country tells the same story in some sort of permutation. The other is that we haven't been properly critical about the contribution of other generally ignored or buried voices in those conversations that enrich and complicate those stories. So rather than have, let's say, a white center and an off-color periphery, we simply deinstalled our entire permanent collection, integrated some familiar objects with objects that we were buying in some loans to produce an exhibition that was very simple in conception. It just simply flip-flopped that proportionality and produced a black-centered post-war art history with a white periphery, just as an experiment in seeing what that would look like. So you're seeing here just a snapshot of that. A Helen Frankenthaler painting, extraordinary work on paper by David Hammonds, an amazing painting from the 70s by Jack Whitten, next to a work by Jasper Johns and a body painting by Clifford Owens. So this is a very different, adventurous way of structuring art history. A lot of what we do at the BMA gets really stellar press. I was always upset that this because it was seen as a permanent collection reshuffle, got very little, but it's actually one of the most adventurous things we did, because it was a short-term experiment in actually changing art history in a permanent collection gallery. Next slide. So then just briefly, this was a bit of a culmination point. This is the Generations, an exhibition I organized with Katie Siegel, which I think was probably in certain ways 10 years in gestation. It's the biggest assembly of post-war Black abstraction that a museum has ever assembled, and it was rooted in our collection, in a few loans, and then in the private collection of Pamela Joyner, who's the most pioneering collector in this area. So this was a deliberately essentialist story that essentially said there is a history of post-war art that you think you know, that you experience in museums all across the country. Here's another one. Which is not to suggest that this needs to be the only one, but it certainly needs to be written into the histories that we think we all know. So next slide. And the next one. So I'm just going to flip for a little bit and pause here. So as you can see, we were pretty aggressive in embracing an art history that we felt the city was ready to receive. And I made that statement in the board meeting, and Amy Sherald at that time was on our board, and she took me aside afterwards and said, I fully and completely support everything that you're doing. This is long overdue. I want to correct you on one front. When you say that the city is ready to receive a story like this, that's fundamentally incorrect. We've been ready. It's just now that the museum is delivering the story that should have been its core for so many decades. So on another level, in 2020, in recognition of the centennial of white women's suffrage in the US, we elected to mark that moment in progress towards full suffrage in the country by committing every exhibition, acquisition, and public program to shows of and about women or female identifying artists. So you're seeing a list, I think this is maybe 28 exhibitions that were to span calendar year 20. And this was done in recognition of that historical moment, but then also some difficult analysis of our own history as a museum. So unlike, or like many other collecting institutions, we did an analysis of our holdings and figured out that of our 95,000 objects spanning time and media, fully 96% are by male artists. And that doesn't put us in particularly rare air. The majority of institutions have that kind of distribution. And so that's a daunting and high mountain to climb, but we felt that we needed to sort of declare that deficit in our collecting history and begin the long, slow, deliberative process of remedying it, but with a short, sharp shock to begin. So we have done some pretty extraordinary work in the short term, but of course haven't made a dent on that 96%. So when I'm asked about, so you've come to the end of 2020 vision. We actually haven't, of course, because we were interrupted by COVID-19, but we're in the midst of it, and it will extend all to November of 2021. What difference do you hope to effect with this? So what I would say is that we hope to affect a significant shift in institutional awareness around what hasn't been done historically, to reckon with the deficits in our own past, frankly, of which there are many, and to begin the slow process of reconstructing a history rooted in actual research and fact, as opposed to latent or conscious bias. So we can't change that 96% proportion, but what we can change is what we're buying and showing. So we show less than 1% of our collection. So that 1%, what's shown on the walls, what's shown in the galleries, can shift very significantly in the short term. So that's the work we're up to at the moment. And the next slide, please. And I'm just, if you wouldn't mind just flipping, I'm going to show you a few things. Candice Price, Katerina Grosso. I'm going to pause here for 1 second. If you go back to the Joan Mitchell slide, this is a really fascinating example. So this show was supposed to have opened, I mean, I've almost lost, I think it was supposed to have opened in the fall of 2020. It's now opening in the spring of 2022, which is not sort of atypical of the way exhibition schedules have shifted due to the pandemic. But when it does open, and actually, funnily enough, although the exhibition hasn't opened, I do have the copy of the doorstop of a catalog. So this is the first comprehensive account of Joan Mitchell's career. It just arrived today in the mail. It's unbelievably handsome. It's unbelievably heavy. It could take me back to my weightlifting days. What's fascinating is that as one of the great contributions to the history of ABEX, she has never had a catalog like that before. There has never been a comprehensive retrospective of her career. And we at the museum have never done a ticketed exhibition focused on a female artist with a publication in our over 100-year history. So this is a first in so many different ways. We're an institution built largely by women. So we're a collection of collections. So the Cohn sisters gave their very famous foundational collection to this museum. Adeline Breeskin was the most significant director in the history of this museum. She courted the Cohn sisters, and ultimately the collection came here. She was also the commissioner for the 1960 Biennale, which presented a survey of American ABEX. Our current board chair is a woman. Many of the chairs of the board historically have been women. And 3 or 4 of the most important collections to have arrived at the museum have been given by women. And yet there are these glaring deficits in the way that registers programmatically through exhibitions and through acquisitions. So we're trying our best to remedy that in the short term, and Joan Mitchell is a pretty extraordinary contribution. So we are actually going to be the only East Coast venue now. It was going to go to the Guggenheim in New York. They had to cancel for financial reasons. So spring of 2022, assuming a brave new world, you should all make the trip, because this is sort of a singular opportunity to see a survey of her work. And the next slide, please. So what we thought was one of the more radical things we could do. Little did we know that there would be, we would outstrip ourselves pretty radically in 2020. But in 2018, having adopted this mission and vision for the museum, it was pretty apparent to me that we didn't have the acquisition funds, the resources, or the war chest to really build the collection that we'd been promising the city of Baltimore. And so we went through a deaccessioning exercise, very slow, very cautious, and landed on 7 objects to sell, one of which is this enormous installation by Robert Rauschenberg. And next image, please. Another enormous canvas by Andy Warhol called Hearts. The next one is an oxidization painting by Andy Warhol. Next, a painting by Kenneth Nolan. Another painting by Kenneth Nolan, which it won't surprise you to know didn't yield too much at auction, and Jules Olitsky here. So we were extremely lucky with this sale, and the end result was a war chest of about $18 million, half of which was designated by donors as a spend down, half of which we've been treating as an endowment. And we've been able to build our collection in extraordinary ways with this resource, and I'm going to show you some images in a second. It was met, as usual, with any sort of first move in a different direction, with a lot of radical opinions spanning the spectrum from the left to the right. Very same with our emphasis on female identifying artists. And one of the charges, of course, was they're selling 7 paintings, all by white men, to buy works of art by men and women of color. So what I say to that is that's absolutely true. That was our objective. But the fact that the value and the redundancy in our collection lies with white male artists should come as no surprise to anyone, because that is itself indicative of the way that bias in the art market and bias in the museum field has structured value within our storage facility. So we're showing less than 1% of our collection. All of these objects were either duplicative or triplicative within the story that we were telling as an institution. Their loss to our holdings didn't substantially impact what we were able to do as a storytelling institution. And so we were able to dispense with them, according to the rules that govern deaccessioning as handed down by AAMD. So it wasn't deliberate that we sold paintings by white men. That's simply a function of history. I think the more important thing is what we were able to do with the resources. So if you keep going with the slides, please. Then there is actually one more, painting by Franz Klein, that we sold. And then the next slide will give you a sense of the objects that we're able to buy. So Wengechi Mutu's absolutely extraordinary sculpture, Water Woman. So this was, now her bronzes adorn the facade of the Met, but this was the very first bronze she ever produced. And if you know anything about casting in bronze, you know that to achieve a surface like that is something that you work at over years and years and years. And this very quickly became the most popular object at the museum, installed, you can't tell here, but installed within our European wing, just before Antioch Court, which is sort of the portal to the rest of the museum's narration of art history. And next slide. Amy Sherrill's amazing, actually very large painting, Planes, Rockets, and the Spaces in Between, which was the first occasion where she used 2 figures in a canvas, and the first also to show a figure from the back. So we make, I think, a habit as an institution of trying to find those tipping points in artists' careers. And if you know anything about Amy's trajectory since this moment, she's gone increasingly large and increasingly sort of multi-figure and dramatic in composition. So this was a pretty astute acquisition. And next slide. And Jessica Crosby, who's since become a megastar, and I think has a forthcoming exhibition at David Warner Gallery. The next painting is a really, really interesting one. So Mary Lovelace O'Neill, I don't know how many people on this call are aware of her work, but I certainly wasn't. We routinely look at auction catalogs issued by Swan. And Swan is an auction house that has dealt in African-American art for decades and decades and decades before there was even a semblance of interest in that work. And so I invariably ask our curators to go through the catalog and see whether there might be anything of interest. Katie Siegel flagged this one and said, I think you should take a close look. So as in the old world, I went to New York, looked at the painting, was absolutely taken with it. We bid on it. We were the only bidder. We ended up buying it for $37,000. It's the first painting that had ever sold by Mary Lovelace O'Neill at auction. We then showed it in the exhibition I discussed earlier on, Every Day, which was coincident with an exhibition opening of Mel Edwards' work and Generations, the enormous history of Black abstraction. And so many artists descended on that opening, museum directors, dealers, and curators. And as a consequence of her being shown in that context, there was a high level of awareness raising around her work. And then if you fast forward 6 months, she had a show at Manutian Gallery, and every painting that was in that exhibition was sold for between $500,000 and $1 million. And she is an artist at the very tail end of her career. She's probably in her 80s, had been living in absolute obscurity in San Francisco. But I sort of narrate that story because I don't think this is just about changing art history. I think it's about changing systems of awareness and trying to bend those systems to suit different outcomes. And this to me was a really profound example of exactly that. And the next slide. So the one mantra that we use at the museum, and this is an easy one to apply in Baltimore, is that our program should be wholly local and wholly global. So the concept meaning that we bring the very best of the international art world to Baltimore, and then we try to telegraph what's so extraordinary about the creative economy here. Valerie Maynard is a really profound example. She's an 85-year-old multimedia artist living and working here, a sort of jewel in our midst. She's distinguished by many things, objects like this one being the most profound, but she was also the artist who set up the first printing studio at the Studio Museum in Harlem way back when, and was very active in the New York scene at that time, migrated to Baltimore, continued making work, but did so in relative isolation. And I think there are many, many of these figures scattered all the way across the country, but we've made it our particular mission to unearth them in Baltimore and give them the opportunity to show their work. So she had a retrospective at the museum that just closed, and again was unjustly interrupted by COVID-19. And the next slide, please. Just another example, Louis Mayo Jones. This was actually brought in through the American department too. So I'm going to start going a little bit more quickly so that we have time for questions. We've been very adventurous in what constitutes outreach into the city of Baltimore at the museum. And I think one falsehood that has structured museum work with communities historically has been the expectation that the city would come to the mothership. And we found over time that just wasn't a feasible way to engage different communities because there was no serendipity of encounter. So we made the decision to set up a permanent branch of the BMA at Lexington Market, which is the longest continuously operating public market in the United States. And it's probably one of our biggest and most adventurous successes at the museum. And I'm just showing you a couple of images from it here. We've been in residence there for a couple of years now. The Lexington Market is going through a total resuscitation and rebuild, and we've again committed to be a part of that. So we'll be the cultural anchor when the Lexington Market reopens. It's right in the heart of Baltimore, and I think one thing we extend through our partnership there is the possibility that people who use the market on a day-to-day basis can have the kind of chance encounter with elite culture that's always been much more of a sort of destination event. There's been the expectation that you get on 3 forms of public transport to come and be transformed by some of the greatest work being done in the world today. Whereas in this case, you can just stumble across it. Public programs have been an enormous part of our profile. You can see that we've gone out of our way to bring great luminaries to speak in Baltimore. And again, this was a way to telegraph our identity to the city and to begin the slow process of earning trust. This is a much more conventional form of museum activity, the sort of all-star speaker. And we have evolved our approach to public programming since this. And that was in part precipitated, the next slide, please, by the advent of COVID-19 and the realization that those big gatherings were not going to be possible. So the question we asked ourselves was, how are we going to listen to our community, meet the needs that they're expressing to us, and do so in a way that's safe during a period of great challenge? We did that in 3 ways. So one, by handing out to families across the city literally thousands of art making kits. And so we called that BMA Studio. And then the next one was BMA Salon. You know, whereas a lot of auction houses, the big anchor auction houses in New York, Sotheby's, Christie's, etc., as well as the mega galleries are going great guns during this pandemic, smaller galleries, smaller not-for-profits, many of whom don't have great online presences, are suffering mightily as a consequence of no foot traffic. So we used our capacity to gather interested art world collectors in particular from across the country and across the world to our website, and created a platform where local galleries and not-for-profits looking to continue to support their artists could do so in a kind of online market space. So that was BMA Salon. And then the next one, Screening Room. This was there is an emerging, and again, I think long overdue, impulse to see artists properly paid and acknowledged for their labor. And you know, Baltimore, there's a real just agitation in that direction. The Screening Room was a way to declare our kind of solidarity with that direction. So we have been showing work by Baltimore-based video artists in the Screening Room, and in certain cases buying the work, but in every case paying them to show the work in these online situations. And that's proved very successful, and something that we're going to migrate hopefully to an outdoor space during the coming warmer months. So next slide, please. So then just reverting back to this concept of structural change, again, it won't surprise you to learn that this museum's board, along with many, was predominantly white. And if you're going to embrace a change agenda, I think you need to do that from the inside, working all the way out. And anybody who's familiar with the functioning and structure of art museums knows that the highest form of governance is the board of trustees, not the director, not the curators, but the reins are held by those who sit in the boardroom. And we wanted our value system, our emerging identity and the connection to the city to be embodied by the boardroom principally. So we have a long way to go, but we've made great strides in that direction. We also appointed this great coup for the museum. And interestingly, Dr. Asma Naeem, if you go to the next slide, please, as our chief curator. Asma has a very, very unusual background in that she was a public prosecutor before she got a PhD in art history, re-entered the museum field, first working within the Smithsonian system, is now the head of our curatorial division. So she brings to the job a sort of balance between social justice-based concepts that were the core of her work as a litigator, with an impulse towards revisionist art history. So this was an extraordinary moment for the museum to be able to appoint a leader like that to our creative ranks. And then the next slide, thank you. So we're looking also at the transformation of our exterior canvas or in campus to better connect with the sort of textures and rhythms of the city. So when John Russell Pope, the great neoclassical architect who built our building, conceived of the structure, he referred to the steps as Baltimore's porch, which is a concept that's stuck with me ever since I read the quote. So we're in the process now of exploring exactly what that might mean. If we were to restore his original vision to the facade of a museum that for many people resembles a courthouse, or at least a governmental building, what would a democracy of access and gathering across class and race lines look like if staged on the facade of our building? So Baltimore's porch is our aspiration in that direction. We've done certain, next slide please, certain experiments with with that in the past little while. Very modestly, this is an installation by Tavares Strachan, which is now removed, unfortunately, but had a long and glorious, quickly iconic life in Baltimore. And next slide, please. And the one after. I'm just going to go a little bit more quickly. There we go. And the next one. So yeah, perfect. Micheline Thomas. So we're fortunate in Baltimore to have families supporting the arts who also have a keen investment in changing the pipeline into the museum field. And so we approached two extraordinary philanthropists, Robert E. Meyerhoff and Rita Becker, to support the establishment of an endowed fund that would every 2 years completely transform our East Lobby into a space that felt welcoming and relevant to the city. So again, reverting back to that idea of John Russell Pope's Baltimore's Porch, Micheline Thomas, the first recipient, asked what would Baltimore's living room look like, and quite literally transformed every single surface in our lobby to look like the kind of 70s row home in a Black neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey, where she grew up. So she tried to take that vocabulary and apply it to our East Lobby. And again, as a possibly happy consequence of COVID-19, this still exists in our lobby space and will for another couple of months. So it's my hope that our visitors have a little bit more time to enjoy it. So, and the next slide. So I'd be, remiss. I'm sure that a lot of you are gathered here to talk a little bit about our proposed 2020 deaccessioning, which was the subject of lots and lots of debate in the art world. So I will shorthand it here and assume that we'll talk about it a little bit more in the Q&A. So we, like every other institution in the grip of COVID-19, went through a kind of existential self-examination. We had to close our doors, re-understand our relevance, begin to think about our course forward in the short term, navigating this extraordinary moment in history, and anticipating what would come next. And we're really fortunate to have in our midst Dr. Janetta Cole, who is our strategic advisor. And in a talk that she gave to our staff, she made the point that while we're living through the advent of a brand new health-based pandemic, there are other afflictions that are far longer term in this country, principal among them race-based discrimination that has created a culture of inequity from the founding of the country to the present. And if this pandemic has done anything, it's thrown into high relief those inequities at all levels of society. And museums, like every other structure, are representative of those systems of inequality. So what are we going to do to address it? So this was, of course, coincident with George Floyd, just protests sweeping the country, and calls by activist groups inside and outside museums to effect immediate and overdue structural change. So reverting back to my original point, not simply buying work by Black American artists, for instance, or doing an exhibition or a public program here and there, but rather bearing down on the very core of an institution to figure out how inequity is riven into that DNA and how we can begin the process of undoing it. So as you all know, AAMD, the governing body for museums, cut museums a little latitude during the COVID-19 period and said that we could deaccession objects from our permanent holdings, not simply to support the acquisition of additional art, which has been the principle historically, but to support other general operating goals. So we saw it as an opportunity to analyze those internal structures that needed to change, put in place endowed funds to allow us to have a very different future. So we proposed deaccessioning 3 paintings that would have yielded about $65 million. It would have allowed us to do 4 things in total. We would have eliminated all charges for changing exhibitions. We would have instituted an unprecedented DAEI startup program and maintenance program for the museum using an endowed structure. We would have channeled about $40 million into an endowed fund that would have achieved pay equity up and down our hierarchy. And we would have instituted one late night per week in recognition of the fact that our opening hours are really inconducive to the way working people experience culture. So cut to October. Ultimately, we elected not to do this in recognition of the fact that it was not in the conception of AMD aligned with the spirit of the leniency that was extended during COVID-19. And I believe we made exactly the right decision. I think you can be out too far ahead of your peers, and that can be as unproductive as being behind. So we made the right decision in pulling back and recalibrating and electing not to do that, remaining aligned with AMD and the standards of our peers in that organization. But we remain very committed to raising that 55 million to meet those four fundamental goals that we see as absolutely transformative for the museum in the coming years. So that is what principally will occupy me over the course of the next 2.5, 3 years. And by the end, I think we should be in a position to not only imagine, but live through those new structures that will take a museum that had very much a traditional set of core values and produce another one entirely. And then if we could go on to the last couple of slides, I will wrap up. So I think what makes the work of running an encyclopedic museum so interesting is the necessity to take the vision that you have that's maybe rooted in the political and creative conditions of the present and apply those principles looking back. So we're on the cusp of being able to realize that goal by dedicating 2 major new study centers at the museum. If you go on to the next slide. The first of those is the Nancy Dorman Stanley Mazeroff Center for the Study of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs. So this is a relatively conventional thing to do within a museum. We have, within our 95,000 objects, you can just hold there for a second, about 65,000 of those are works on paper. It's one of the handful of best collections in that area in the country. We can narrate pretty much an uninterrupted history of art from the late 15th century all the way to the present using those holdings. And we have never in our history dedicated a public space to the presentation of the collection. So this will be the first time for that, many, many years overdue. And then adjacent to it, we are dedicating the Ruth R. Marder Center for Matisse Studies. And if you could go on to the next slide, please. And the next one, and the one after that. So the Matisse Center is intended to telegraph and capitalize on the fact that we are the home for Matisse's work in the world. We have the deepest, largest collection of the artist's work in all media in any public hands, and little known fact. And we wanted to telegraph these 2 extraordinary facts to the broader art world, to the world at large, and to our local community, and use these spaces within the museum to forge what I would call Baltimore's largest classroom for the study of art history. These are fully public centers. Anybody can make an appointment to physically encounter a work of art. We imagine partnering with K through 12 classes, as well as college classes, to extend the amazing possibility that young people could learn art history from objects as opposed to from books. And I'm sure the vast majority of people on this call, certainly the professors, myself included, learned art history from a book as opposed to through objects. I'm a really firm believer that the magic of art history is encased within the object and within the close study of its physicality. And I think to extend that free to Baltimore City schools, among other systems, will be to produce an entirely different group of art historians to analyze and tell the art histories of the future. So this will be a big moment for us in the fall of 2021. And part and parcel of our commitment, not only to change ourselves, but change the pipeline into art and art history to produce a next generation of leaders. So very much about the past and very much about the future too. So I have monologued for 50 minutes, and I thank you for sticking with me. And if anybody has any questions, we can definitely chat.
So it sounds like there's already a question. The general way I see, Lynn, you're raising your hand. The general way we do lining up for questions is you just type stack into the chat, And like I just did, you type stack, and then I keep the stack and I go down the stack to so people can ask lots of questions. So I'm very excited that lots of people already have questions. I think Shelley Lake was first in there. So Shelley, do you want to say your question?
Hi.
Lynn and Jared on stack. Sorry about that, Shelley. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was, seems like you pretty much answered it, but maybe you could drill down on how social equity forms curation.
Oh yeah. I think that's it's a really fundamental question. So, if you go back to the origins of curatorial work, it is a space of extraordinary privilege. So in Britain in particular, when the profession was born, it was unpaid, and it was just seen as a privilege of the landed class to care for objects. And I think that general perception has perpetuated across centuries and has produced a workforce that has the great privilege of working with high culture, but is highly undercompensated. And I think if you put those two things together, you get a highly privileged, highly narrow class of professional. So in this country, that would be principally white upper middle class. So you can stand being underpaid because you have money to fall back on. You can stand going to school for 10 years because you have some sort of ballast that will keep you, housed and clothed and eating. And I think that produces a really narrow range of analysis. So I think the way to address that is purely economic. You have to give people incentive through paid opportunity to enter a field with the promise that they can actually succeed. So to me, to change the professional structure of museum work is to first change the compensation pipeline into it. That's unbelievably important to me. So you have to pay fellows, you have to pay interns, you have to pay assistant curators more than $38,000 a year because it's just not viable to live that way in the 21st century. So it's funny. I thought I'd be a professor. It turns out that the most radical thing I can do in the museum is think economically. Who knew?
Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, am I unmuted? Okay. Yeah, it was very, very interesting. Let me ask you this. When you look at the fundraising for your programs and for your acquisitions, is there any other large area you look at besides deaccessioning?
Yes.
A pot of money that you can see out there.
That's a great question. So, I'll answer it two ways. One, just to sort of toe the AEMD line, but push on it a little bit here. Mm-hmm. What I would say is that museums are highly, highly undercapitalized, and particularly with respect to the achievement of mission in relationship to a community. And at the same time, we have way too much art. So with those 95,000 objects don't have great utility to us because we can use only a fraction of them. So mm-hmm. We're undercapitalized, and we have these enormous banks of illiquid assets. So my feeling is that museums have to be incentivized through some sort of structure handed down by a governing entity to think about the responsible liquidation of those illiquid assets to begin with justice in mind to meet mission. So that we don't have any source of revenue even vaguely comparable to what exists in storage in museums. Yeah. Certainly we have private philanthropy, we have foundations who are supportive, we have corporations who are supportive, but there is no self-sustaining source of funding like that native to museums. So I'm certainly not advocating for opening Pandora's box and selling it all off to become a need-based community center. But I do think that there needs to be a relaxation of those rules that will incentivize museums to think about those basic questions of justice and diversity in the future.
Yeah, and when you did it in 2018,
yeah,
didn't get in trouble, if that's the word, because because at least half of it went for buying new artwork.
Actually, 100% went to buying art.
Okay, well then you were not in you never have a problem with
it was straightforward art for art, and so that is precisely compliant with AEMD's traditional standards. What we did there was backlash from the right
Yeah.
in response to our doing that, but there wasn't the same kind of museum-based agitation that
Right.
attended the 2020 effort.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jared is next on Stack.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. This relates a little bit to what Lynn was asking about, I think, which is, as you've undertaken some of these new initiatives that you were outlining to us, did you unlock new sources of funding, meaning donors who had not given before? And then perhaps related, if you can speak to conversations you might have had with donors to reallocate restricted gifts to cover some of this. I'm curious.
So that's an excellent question. Maybe you're going to be museum director. We have not gone through the process of reallocating existing funds at present, because we don't feel that we need to do that. And we have also not lent heavily on acquisition funds, which we're permitted to do during COVID-19, and repurpose those funds for general operating. We have found that there is another group or generation of philanthropists who exist right on that threshold between social change and art's capacity to suggest that change, that are willing to be robustly supportive of institutions who are pushing on that. We did telegraph, I think, to the world very boldly in October our direction and intention, and it has generated substantial generosity, which I think will eventually propel us to achieve that 55 million goal. So do I think that awareness would have been raised had we not taken the action? Maybe not. And were it not for COVID-19, would I have had the ideas that structure the endowment for the future? Maybe not. So it's all been this incremental, I think, learning process, but the goal has always remained the same: the creation of an internal culture of equity and diversity, and a fully and completely publicly accessible institution.
Suzanne had a couple of questions, and then Stack is open. Suzanne has no audio, so I will read her questions. Number one, when appointing new board members, did you lower the fundraising precondition?
No, we didn't. But I will also say, and I'm not sure how candid I'm permitted to be about the dollars associated with board service at the BMA. I will just say this: the required contribution is not particularly prohibitive at the museum. Now, that the baseline requirement for contribution, that does not mean that we have an extraordinary board, an extraordinarily generous one, and many people by an exponential degree exceed that that minimum giving level. But this is not, the Museum of Modern Art or the Met, where those numbers are exponential and immediately weed out, 99.99% of the population. That's not the condition at all. So we, like every other museum, look at these ideas of work and wisdom and wealth in assessing board members, and we think about their contribution to the creative ecology. I also think we bear in mind the extent to which they come to the task with a necessary degree of value and vision alignment. I mean, that's almost the most important thing. I mean, certainly we need financial support. Certainly we need people who are willing to work, and certainly we need people who are connected enough to help us navigate philanthropy. But we also need that kind of belief that comes from feeling and living the values of the museum. So, and abiding by, on a day-to-day basis, the principles that we believe will propel us to a sort of new tomorrow. So we use that fourth principle in assessing board members really vigilantly, and it's produced I think a different kind of atmosphere on our board, which is really exciting.
And then the second question, did you face any litigation from deaccessioning?
No. I mean, look, we did not face any litigation. If you followed along with the press, there were some people who were extremely angry. And, I think some of the claims made were, why can't you just achieve? Of course, we believe in your equity and diversity mission, but can't you achieve it by other means? And So the answer to that question is we're stalwart enough that we will, but I still believe that collections in particular are emblematic of a particular system of power that needs to be analyzed. And again, I don't believe that it should be a Pandora's box situation, but I do think we need to put pressure on the historical habits that have governed our discipline, and to understand that museum structures, like every other structure, are emblematic of white-centered power in this country. And that using language like that, and I think freely use it in an academic context like this, did publicly rub people the wrong way. But I do believe in the idea that we have to be deeply self-critical, even if it's painful, and use terminology that might be a little painful to imagine what comes next.
I guess I can ask a quick question. I'll put myself on stack as people line up. But my question was just in terms of sort of your tracking your audience data, do you have a sense over the last few years, like how in your time at BMA, how the racial, class, et cetera, composition of your audience has changed? Has it changed? How much?
Yeah, no, it's a fabulous question. It's an interesting one vis-a-vis funding in particular, because I can give a presentation like that and a potential funder can be wowed by all the change. But the inevitable question is, has this produced a substantively different audience, and can you codify that shift for me? Because ultimately that's the measure of the mission. So were we not interrupted by a year by this pandemic, I think probably we would have had that data last fall. Unfortunately, losing that year has derailed us a little bit. So probably a year from now, I'd be able to answer your question a little bit more accurately. We have an extraordinary woman who works in the museum named Melanie Martin, who we call our Chief Innovation Officer. And she's sort of a walking computer and is able to translate every anecdote, every visitor, into data. So she will eventually codify that so that I can answer your question properly. What I'll say is that walking around the museum, it is absolutely palpable. It is the people in our museum are pound for pound representative of the city of Baltimore, which is the ultimate goal.
Great. Robin, I believe, is next, or Robin's iPhone.
Chris, as a fellow British Museum art director, I mean, I guess my big question is, in the bigger scheme of things, what do you think post-COVID is the future of the art museum? Is that going to fundamentally change? You've talked a lot about board and development and funding, and I just wonder whether we're looking at a sort of tipping point in terms of how museums operate in the future. And obviously, you've taken a great lead at Baltimore in terms of what you're doing, but I would welcome your thoughts on the big picture about where we will be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 25 years from now.
I mean, I'm not sure I can stare into the crystal ball and be precise in what I see, but there are a couple of things that really stick out to me. One is that endowment growth is unbelievably important in maintaining economic autonomy. That's the thing that really protects museums from vulnerability. So I think that there'll be a renewed emphasis on endowment growth, so that if one has to close one's doors, there is much less vulnerability that comes from taking that action. So institutions like MoMA that have done extraordinarily well during unencumbered periods have suffered unbelievably economically as a consequence of closing their doors. So there's a new kind of vulnerability. So with the BMA being principally a free museum, we actually can more effectively ride these things out. So that's an economic analysis. Another is, I do not think that the grassroots collective agitation that you see from within and beyond the museum is going to abate until the fundamental structures we use to govern change. That's not going away. And I think it's disingenuous to show protest art without being a protest movement. I mean, you can't do it. You can't show art that demands change while maintaining a status quo. And I think the fallacy of that has been thrown into really high relief. And then just sort of finally, I would say some questions around what constitutes governance at museums on the board level is going to change. And I think a couple of you were gesturing towards this. So, you know, if making an enormous annual contribution to the museum is the fundamental prerequisite for board service, does that limit you too greatly in who you can have around the table guiding the mission and vision of the museum? So, you know, corporate boards, for instance, recruit people who perform great service and they pay them for that service. So museums do the opposite. We don't pay our extraordinary trustees. We expect them to support us. So it's a, you know, a very different kind of a model. And my feeling is we've come a long way on our board, and because we've kept our required contributions relatively low, it means we can have great diversity around the table. So I think you'll see some shifts more in that direction too. I mean, it's almost day-to-day reporting. The Leon Black reporting is everywhere in the art world press at the moment. So I don't see it changing or going away.
Shelley, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, is there any unexpected long-term effect from the COVID-19?
Well, I mean, I think that responsible future planning for, you know, a sustainable financial model in museums will be more reliant on endowment because it's not a source of support that's contingent upon a third party. And I think you'll see a lot of museums, and I think this is amazingly valuable, going in the direction of embracing free entry, which serves the dual purpose of protecting a museum against the economic threat of closing doors, and at the same time making itself more publicly accessible. So, you know, I sort of search for those rays of light within the gloom of a pandemic. But if one ray of light is that museums see it as both strategic and morally beneficial to be free, that would be a really terrific outcome. And I do believe that you'll see that. So endowment growth, more free museums, which is tending more towards the European model. And it may imply more, you know, state and city support for culturals.
And we'll close out with Juliet as a question.
You mentioned earlier when talking about the painter who you sort of discovered that awareness about new artists is really important. And I was just kind of wondering how that happens if it's not, you know, through the traditional art market and whatnot. Like, how do we get exposure?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I still think that it is the, you know, the province of museums to be adventuresome and to show the art of the present, because, you know, the boldness it requires to interrogate the present through making work that's eventually public is extraordinary. And one thing I know about this museum's history is that when we've elected to work with a living artist and we've given them a changing exhibition and we haven't bought a work from that exhibition, our collection has been radically impoverished by the decision not to invest. So I think the threat of not investing in the young and the new is much higher than the risk of, you know, slightly missing the mark. I think we have, you know, 23 curators at the museum. It's like hundreds of years of postgraduate education. And you know, my bet is that they're quite astute in looking at work and electing what to buy for the museum. So I really empower them to think adventuresomely, buy when artists are young because it's the right thing to do and it provides them with support. And I think it provides the public with an opportunity to see something that's new and uncomfortable and maybe illuminating. So I think museums have to continue to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think it's about time for us, but thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. Deeply appreciated for the work and for the talk.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it tremendously.
And come back anytime.
Of course.
The door is open. I have a feeling that we're not going to be out of the crisis anytime soon. No. One crisis or another.
The door remains open. Well, I thank you for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. And to To everyone, thank you for joining us on a Friday night. And again, the dates of the next talks in our lecture series. Clay Woman is on, wait, I wrote this down, March 26th, our 500 million year old alien. And then April the 16th is critical theorist Samir Gandesha. Please join us for those. And thanks again so much, Chris.